raise a glass to the past, and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bard who said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome one and all to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass and to pull up a chair as we gather together right here in our favorite corner of the Cross Time Pub, exploring not only the ancient past but also new discoveries, perhaps even new human species from long ago. Joining me as always here in this archaic lounge of insight are my colleagues James Waldo, the Man of Stone, and Jason Pentrail, the newly retired avocationalist, archaeologist extreme, right here. How you doing, retirement man?
Well, this is the third official day. I've got the swag that comes along with it, including the coffee mug. So, waking up and not having to fight traffic or log on to a work computer has been pretty nice on the third day so far.
I will predict that it'll be good on the fourth day and on the fifth day and on the sixth day and all the days after that. And also, you probably won't miss it at all.
Yeah, that seems to be the case so far. In fact, I'm just trying to sort out what to do with this newly found free time. But of course, you know, I got a million things going on as well. So I'm keeping myself busy, catching up on reading and also running around doing all the stuff for the kids and all their school projects and all that great stuff. So it's a little bit different flow, different lifestyle, but hey, I'll take it. It's a decided improvement for sure.
That is a state of being I don't think I'll ever be familiar with, having free time. My newest hobby, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, is just going through different kinds of lozenges I can use so that I don't lose my voice. Hey, you know, you got to run your mouth for a living in this business, right? But I'll tell you something interesting. There's a lot of insightful information coming out of the University of Hawai'i lately, where researchers have made some rather controversial revelations, I would say. I think that there are some in the anthropological community right now who are still in the process of warming up to this. Guys, have you seen all this about the proposed new human species, Homo juluensis? The reason I say this is controversial is because, of course, even the professors who are involved in this study, one of them, by the way, Christopher J. Bai, again from the University of Hawai'i at Manoa's Department of Anthropology, he said he didn't start all this expecting to name a new ancient human species, let alone one into which now some of the ancient hominins, including the mysterious Denisovans, may now also be incorporated, which is part of why this is so intriguing. Now, according to a press release that was put out the other day by the University of Hawai'i, they say Homo juluensis lived approximately 300,000 years ago in Eastern Asia, hunted wild horses in small groups, made stone tools, and possibly processed animal hides for survival before disappearing around 50,000 years ago. It was proposed that the new species include the enigmatic Denisovans, a population known primarily through DNA evidence from a few physical remains found in Siberia, and a few fossils, of course, found in Tibet and Laos. But more research is clearly needed in order to test that relationship, which is primarily based on similarities between jaw and teeth fossils from these different sites. Now, you guys will probably know about some of the fossils that have been incorporated into this new research, because one of them has long intrigued me. It's known as the Pinghu 1 fossil. And it's just a large, obviously robust jaw that does not seem to belong to Homo sapiens sapiens. In fact, we know it didn't. It had been proposed that it might be Neanderthal, but it doesn't appear to be that either. In fact, up until recently, it was just considered an unrecognized hominin from sometime in the Pleistocene. Now, just think about that. That fascinates me. I'm really intrigued by the idea of unrecognized hominins. And another, perhaps more pertinent example of the fossils that led to Bai and his colleagues' research, and of course the determination of this new designation, Homo juluensis, had involved some Chinese fossils that were discovered back all the way in the 1970s. And this is another trend that we tend to see a lot in archaeology, paleoanthropology, paleontology, in fact, maybe geology too, James, where there's a discovery made decades ago, and it may sit in a museum for decades before eventually researchers come upon it and they realize, my gosh, this is something unique. We see ancient fossil species that are kind of put away in a drawer someplace, sometimes thought to be something else, before ultimately it is finally determined that there's something morphologically or otherwise that indicates it's an entirely new species. So that's part of what's happening right here. But equally intriguing are that the Chinese fossils that were discovered back in the 1970s that were really central to this new Homo juluensis designation have been the fact that these cranial features were extremely large on these hominins. Yet again, they were like Neanderthal, not unlike in terms of the dentology, what is known of the Denisovans, but the head is extremely large, and so again, that name Homo juluensis roughly translates to mean large-headed, and it's referring again to the very enigmatic appearance of these ancient humans. But again, as has now been reported, some are saying that perhaps Penghu and these other Chinese fossils, and even the Denisovans, they all may actually belong essentially to a similar group. And that's a fascinating discovery that, although intended to help with science communication, is no doubt probably going to arouse some controversy, I would say. And in response to this news, a lot of the science coverage, including an article that I wrote over there at thedebrief.org, has looked at the diversity of opinions with relation to this grouping of fossils. Again, quoting researcher Bai in the press release that came from Hawaii University, he says this study clarifies a hominin fossil record that has tended to include anything that cannot easily be assigned to Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis, or Homo sapiens. Although we started this project several years ago, he says, we did not expect to be able to propose a new hominin, in other words, essentially an ancient human ancestor, and there's still a little bit of confusion about that because that's a fairly recent addition to the lexicon. Previously, we would have said hominid, and we say hominin with regard to those very near cousins to humans of the archaic kind. But as Bai continues, we were able to organize the hominin fossils from Asia into different groups, and ultimately this should help with science communication. But fundamentally, as the press release here from the University of Hawaii says, this should help scientists and, of course, the rest of us better understand the complex story of human evolution in Asia and fills in some of those gaps in our understanding of our ancient relatives. Now, one might have to ask, is it impossible that there may not be others out there in the fossil record, other discoveries, even very similar to humans, that remain unknown to science or at least unrecognized, but yet again, that could potentially help us fill in our family tree? We would have said no, probably, until a few years ago, but then we had Homo floresiensis, we had the Denisovans, again known primarily from just teeth, maybe the tip of a finger, and more recently we also had some jaw portions, no complete human remains, in order to help us fill in the picture in terms of what Denisovans looked like. But now again, although some may see this as a further complication, the aim here is to try and better understand and group these fossil types and ultimately help with science communication. James?
Well, I was just curious, was there an approximate date or age associated with these new findings?
Yes, these Pleistocene fossils are believed to date to a period, again, maybe going back as far as 300,000 years and up until as recently as 50,000 years. And again, one thing we have to keep in mind here is that we don't really have good fossil evidence that shows that those archaic hominins existed much more recently than 50,000 years ago. But I've often said, is it also a possibility that maybe we are seeing a sort of a bias in terms of we look for fossils where fossils are likely to be preserved, but those may not always indicate that those fossils, or perhaps the species that left us those fossils, didn't thrive in other areas that were not conducive to fossil formation. And again, the question therefore would be, is the bias that we receive from our interpretation of the data that maybe the Neanderthals only existed until around 50,000 years ago, Homo juluensis maybe only existed until around that time? Again, initially, and this is what intrigues me, there were nearer-term estimates about Penghu 1 that supposed that it was possible, maybe not likely, but possible that that hominin jaw that was discovered, which now again is being associated with Homo juluensis, that might have been far more recent than researchers would have expected. I think that some of those near estimates placed this maybe around 10 to 15,000 years ago. And again, I think there are a lot of paleoanthropologists who would say highly unlikely, right? I mean, we don't think that there was anything like humans that was not anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, that recently. But again, one has to wonder.
The fossil record, as you guys know, is largely incomplete. And it takes, I would say it takes a lot of individuals to leave remains to for any one to be fossilized, and then you have to find it, right? So there were lots of needles and lots of haystacks, but as the needles kind of get lost to history or get completely consumed by the weathering process that happens on the surface of the planet, the odds of finding the answers to the complete answer to the human question, right, is probably not going to happen. So we just have to keep looking. We just have to keep looking and putting the puzzle pieces together. And someday maybe we'll learn some more, and someday maybe we won't.
I mean, again, a point to be made here is the fact that if we really, and I'm not saying we shouldn't rely on fossils, it's the best information that we have. It obviously informs us. But, I mean, look at how little we have in the way of fossils from Denisovans. Look at how little we have in the way of a lot of different extinct species. In terms of what little is known about them from the fossil record, we can sometimes make tremendous determinations, I mean, really advanced conclusions, even sequencing their genome. But again, that still doesn't necessarily give us a clear idea about how they looked, how they behaved, how similar they were to humans, what their differences were. There's still a lot of questions, and we may also have to settle, essentially, like you were saying, James, for accepting that there are going to be limitations in terms of how much we can know. So it's frustrating, but it's also fascinating, and I'm equally intrigued to see where this story takes us and what the new developments may be. But, on the subject of new developments, Jason, why don't we come over to you and you tell us what's been developing over there, what you've been cooking in your laboratory for subscribers?
Well, over on our Patreon channel, we have the continuation of several different podcasts. I'm working on episodes right now of Cross Time Pub, and we have just launched a brand new book on the Green Dragon Book Club, which is The Radium Girls, The Dark Story of America's Shining Women by Kate Moore. So that's leading to a very, very interesting conversation. And remember that the Green Dragon Book Club is by the listeners, for the listeners. So if you go over and join us on Patreon, you can actually participate in these discussions as a member there on the Patreon channel for the 7 Ages audio journal. Just put that into the search bar. It should pop right up, and you can see everything that we have to offer there. Also have some very focused interviews on the Digging Deeper show. Again, that's exclusive content that you can find there on the 7 Ages Audio Journal Patreon channel. And then we also now have a TeePublic store where you can pick up 7 Ages merchandise, everything that you would expect around the holiday season. We've got t-shirts, we've got hoodies, sweaters, coffee mugs, all of the types of things that you may want for that holiday gift. Remember, that can be found in the show notes and also by searching 7 Ages Podcast there on the TeePublic website. So again, lots of new things going on as we move into January of 2025, always looking to add a few new products and also get some new podcasts out there for everyone to hear over on Patreon.
Something new I'm looking forward to in the new year as well, by the way, is what Jason Pentrail will look like when he has a beard, James, because now that he's retired, it's just a matter of time before he joins the Facial Hair Club. Now, granted, I mean, I'm not like necessarily really some sort of a role model in the Facial Hair Club myself. What you see right here is about as much as you're going to get. But nonetheless, I think that now that he is free from his duties and he is a retired man, fairly young to be retired, and all the better. But he's going to look older here soon because he's going to have a beard, isn't he?
Yeah. And it's actually a requirement to get into the retired military club. You got to grow a beard as a guy.
Yes, it is indeed, James. Well, again, everybody head on over to 7ages.org. You'll find all the information about us and where you can follow us online right there. And we'll have to post some images of Jason's facial hair and the progress as we move into the new year. But for the time being, I think it's important for us to dive into the interview portion here where Dr. Carl Drexler will be joining us. And Jason, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what we're about to hear.
On this particular interview, we're going to be talking about the Caddo. So we've had requests in the past concerning the Caddo. They're really well known there, especially in southern Arkansas. Very artistic group of Native Americans, long history. And so with Dr. Drexler, we're going to get into some of the specifics and the details surrounding the Caddo culture.
I'm already very intrigued. So when we come back after this, Dr. Carl Drexler discusses the Caddo culture right here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Tonight on the Seven Ages Audio Journal, we welcome Dr. Carl Drexler to the show. Dr. Drexler is a station archaeologist and research associate professor at the University of Arkansas. He received his Ph.D. from the College of William and Mary in Virginia in 2013. He has been working in Arkansas since 2001 on domestic and military sites, including the battlefield of Pea Ridge. He has worked as an archaeologist for the National Park Service, Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, and the United States Army. He has field experience in 8 states and 3 foreign countries. His major research interests include conflict archaeology, spatial analysis, historical archaeology of the U.S. South and Midwest, Cuban archaeology, terrestrial and aerial laser scanning or LiDAR. His publications include articles in the SAAJ Archaeological Record, as well as the Arkansas Historical Quarterly and a book chapter on spatial analysis in conflict archaeology. Dr. Drexler, welcome to the Seven Ages Audio Journal.
Thank you for having me.
Well, yeah, it's always great to meet new people in the world of archaeology. The Caddo is something that we're going to get into tonight in a very specific site. I know that a lot of our listeners are very interested in this topic, so I think it will make for a great show. Now, when I was doing your introduction here tonight, we talked about some of your research interests, and you have some very unique specialties and interests. So let's begin there tonight. Tell us a little bit about kind of your overview in the world of archaeology and kind of a little bit of how you ended up where you're at now.
I've had a very circuitous path through archaeology. I actually started off doing pre-contact Southwestern archaeology in undergrad, and then I had an interest in sort of antebellum history as a child, and the summer before my senior year, I had the opportunity to take 2 archaeological field schools, and the second one happened to be at an antebellum sawmill community in northwest Arkansas. And I got hooked on doing that time period and that sort of rough geographic context. And one of the guys that I took the field school from, the late Dr. Jamie Brandon, knew I had an interest in some conflict studies research, and convinced me to go to the SAAJ's, the Society for Historical Archaeology meetings in Mobile in 2003. And I had just read some of the work on the Little Bighorn battlefield that was done by Doug Scott and a couple other folks. And I was at the conference. I got on a bus to take a tour, and I was reading name tags of people going by, and one of the guys who went past said Doug Scott on the name tag. And so I walked up to him at the first stop, and just total fanboy moment. I think my voice even broke trying to introduce myself because it was an undergrad still, and this was the greats of the field. And he turned out to be the nicest guy, and we spent a lot of that tour talking, and I wound up going to Nebraska to do my master's with him, starting work on Pea Ridge National Military Park, and then went off to the original plan was to do my dissertation on San Juan Hill in Cuba. For various geopolitical reasons, that didn't take place, but I wound up going back to work with Jamie Brandon when he was working here in Arkansas, and did my dissertation research on basically civil-military interactions during wartime, looking at a site here in southwest Arkansas. Eventually, after working for the Army for a little bit, got the opportunity to come to work for the Arkansas Archaeological Survey, and I started off as a station assistant in my office, and now I run it. So that's my job. And since, given where the station is, we're a regionalized program, and that has basically required me to read into the archaeology of the Caddo nation. It's been a really interesting experience, and I think coming to it, from the standpoint of someone who didn't go through grad school for pre-contact Southeastern stuff, a little bit of an outsider's view coming into it. I think I see it a little differently from some other folks. But it's been a really great experience, a really interesting research community.
Yeah, well, it's always appreciated to get those different views. I think that's great, and it should make for an interesting part of the conversation tonight. Now, again, you mentioned here at your research area. So until I was digging into some of your work, I really hadn't become familiar with what you mean by a research area. So I understand that the state is broken down archaeologically by different regions. Is that correct?
That's correct. And we also The survey, the Arkansas Archaeological Survey, is a unit of the University of Arkansas system. And though our headquarters is in Fayetteville, where the flagship campus is, we have 10 research stations that are scattered around the state, appended to either another state educational institution, or we have a couple that are at state parks. And we're basically tasked with doing research and public outreach and a couple other work areas for territories. So I'm in the southwest corner of the state, based in a small university called Southern Arkansas University, home of the Mule Riders. It's one of my favorite college mascots ever. And I have 11 counties that I am primarily tasked with doing research on, and helping with, if we have historical groups that need help writing a grant, if we need people to serve on boards for steering certain foundations that are historically focused. We're here to basically help the people have research territories in those ways. And my research territory falls almost exclusively within the ancestral homeland of the Caddo Nation. So that's how I got so interested in their history.
Yeah, well, that makes perfect sense. And so when we talk about the Caddo, as you mentioned there, your area encompasses a major portion of their ancestral lands. I know they're known for their artwork and things like that, but tell us a little bit more about the Caddo culture, their ancestral lineage, things like traits and their art style, maybe even their origins. Just a little bit of background information on who the Caddo actually are.
Well, it's obviously that's a very complex question. Most of what I'm going to tell you is from an archaeological standpoint. The Caddos themselves, when they talk about their history in this region, they trace their lineage back to time immemorial. In fact, some of their origin stories, at least the recorded versions, have them emerging into this world here in basically what is now Southwest Arkansas in the Red River Valley. We have a few written versions of the origin stories that date back to around 1905 that were recounted by tribal members. There's a version by a guy by the name of Dashkat Hakaya, basically translates to white bread. That was written down by George Dorsey and published right around that time. That's one of our key versions of the Caddo creation story, and that they have them coming up somewhere around what we call the Great Bend, which is basically on the Red River, where it turns from going east-west and being the border between Oklahoma and Texas, and then it drops south to go into Louisiana. And for them, they've been the same people forever. When archaeologists talk about the Caddos, they really start using that term in this area for peoples who are here around 800 AD. Before that, we have everything back to Paleo-Indian sites in this area. And for the woodland period, the label of choice is called the Fushmaline. So for Fushmaline Creek in eastern Oklahoma. And that's that, the Fushmaline period is basically, woodland. The Caddos are largely similar to other groups that fall within the Mississippian tradition. But, one of the interesting things about studying the Caddos is that the way that other archaeologists, sort of talk about Mississippi, and they either never mention the Caddos because they're real far west, or you'll see sort of bracketing terms like Caddoan Mississippian, as though they're not sort of classically Mississippian. And there's some good reasons for that. There's greater connection to the plains, which are immediately west of here. The Caddos are basically the end of the eastern woodlands. And there are more connections that you can draw to the plains and even to the southwest in Mexico than you get with a lot of other groups. Famous Spiro site in eastern Oklahoma, right near Fort Smith. The Caddos are, they draw their connection there. Several decades ago, I believe there was a piece of green obsidian sourced to the Pachuca deposit in central Mexico that was found there. So there's a little more sort of westward inflected version of the Mississippians. Like a lot of other Mississippian groups, they're primarily corn agriculturalists. They're unlike other Mississippian groups, in that, like, when you get to the late Mississippian period, right around the time that a lot of groups to the east are nucleating into these big palisaded villages, the Caddos never do that. They actually maintain a way of living where you have these sort of large mound centers that have probably a priest and a political leader, a very small caretaker population, and then everybody lives in small farmsteads around there. But they're not a single nucleated village. So some of the evidences for warfare and conflict that are likely driving people to sort of come together for mutual defense, we don't see here. It's a really interesting aspect to them. But like you said, they're famous for their pottery. They're also were the beneficiaries of living in the native range of the Osage orange, otherwise known as Maclura pomifera, also sometimes referred to as bodark, because it's some of the best bowwood you're going to find. They also had access to salt deposits that some other groups didn't. So they're known to be salt makers. In fact, when DeSoto comes through in the 1540s, one of the place names that he records for the Great Bend area looks like Naguatex, if you want to anglicize it, would be Nawatesh, which John Swant in the 1920s interpreted that as being a Spanish corruption of Nawitish, which in Caddo would be the place of the salt makers. So it's been a big salt making area for a long time.
Yeah, and that's another fascinating aspect. That's not something that you generally hear about, except in this kind of small area, regional context. So I think that's a very interesting part of this as well. And we're going to get into that as we move through the interview tonight. Let's begin to talk about the site of Holman Springs, also known as Nakukuwitish. Let's talk a little overview and a history of the site. And I know this is something that you've worked on personally, so break the site down for us. Why was it selected and how did it come about?
The site we know about it because there was a navigational archaeologist by the name of Ernest Seibert who lived in DeQueen, Arkansas, which is right near where the site is. And he was very passionate about learning where native sites were in the 50s and 60s. And around about 1960, we had a crew come to the area. It was a river basin survey archaeological program they were creating what was now Lake Millwood nearby. And one of the archaeologists they sent was Dr. Emily Blazingham. And Ernest basically corralled her and took her around, and they documented a whole bunch of sites together. And we have those now in our site files because of their efforts. In the 1980s, there was a lot of interest placed in having the Arkansas Archaeological Society's training program held at the site. And the training program is a really fascinating thing. I mean, a lot of states do this. Humbly suggest that ours is one of the earliest, and it's been one of sort of the biggest long-running programs. We've had it every year since 1964, and barring the pandemic. But we've had on this site up to 130 people involved in the projects. And in 1985 and 1986, my predecessor, the late Frank Schambach, led 2 of these training programs on the site. And that started his work. Now, for various reasons, he didn't finish it. And so we've been going back to gather the data that we need to finish Frank's project. It's from to do good archaeology, you got to finish the projects as you start. So we're working at finishing that out now, and it's some of that's been just simply pulling together what any reference we can find about what the site was, how it was constructed, what all was there. Because a lot of it we know changed before we actually even got to excavate on it. But it consisted at least of one large mound, possibly one smaller mound. That was sort of the most that was known about it up until the 1980s digs. And then since the 1980s, we've been learning a whole lot more about it. It's been a really interesting project.
So, topographically, is it the excavation is occurring in a agricultural field? How close is it? Close to a river? What are we looking at?
It's on the edge of a salt marsh near the Rolling Fork River in western Arkansas. It is on the very edge of a cattle pasture at the moment. It's actually, most of it's outside the fence line for it, which makes it easy to have these big projects and not interfere with the landowners' cattle operations. And it's actually, since it's on the edge of a salt marsh, it's been kind of nice to be that close to a body of water in an Arkansas summer and not be eaten alive by mosquitoes. Has been a great luxury, but there's, I think, a high enough salt content that the you don't get mosquitoes in the adjacent pond. You get alligators and water moccasins, but those are a little easier to see coming.
Yeah, I would rather deal with those than mosquitoes any day. At least, yeah, like you said, you can see them coming. So let's talk about salt and salt marshes. Again, that's a very unique feature that we see that we don't really see at too many other sites that I'm aware of. So talk about that salt marsh and what was being produced there and how it was being made. What was the significance of the salt marsh?
Yeah, well, a lot of the Southeast has some fairly deeply buried salt deposits underneath. It's probably, relict seafloor from, if you're going back several hundred million years. What I think we're dealing with here with this site is we have two what we call salt diapirs or salt domes in sort of central and western Arkansas. There's one around where this site is, and then if you go east about 70 or 100 miles, there's another one, and there's some other salt works noted there. So they're basically areas where you have these real deeply buried salts. The overlying strata have cracked, and the weight has essentially pushed the salt up closer to the surface. And those salt deposits are now close enough that groundwater can wash through them, and it makes these sort of salt marshes and salty briny ponds where people basically made it accessible to people. And we know people use these resources for literally hundreds of years, and they still use them down to today. In fact, here in Southwest Arkansas, one of the things that we're looking or keeping an eye out for is lithium production based on those salts for car batteries and that kind of thing. It's likely to be one of our next big economies. Acknowledging certain, ecological issues with that is something that's coming, and it's, our heritage of using salt resources goes back hundreds of years, and this is just the final stage.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the settlement, the Holman Springs or Nakukawiddish site, the reason that we're using those two names is for a very specific reason. Can you talk about where the second name comes from, Nakukawiddish versus Holman Springs?
Yeah, so when we came out of the field at the end of last year, we had, over the past couple of years, been working with the Caddo Nation to develop the research designs for these big summer projects. And I always thought that Holman Springs it's a nice name, but it doesn't one that emphasizes the connections to the past very well. It references Gene Holman, who was the landowner in the 1960s when the site was recorded. And that's a very common thing for us. We often will stick a name on a site, based on the landowner. But given the heavy Caddo connection, I was interested in seeing if we could find a Caddo name that would emphasize the Caddo connections a little more. And so got talking with their tribal historic preservation officer, and they put me in contact with, they have a linguist, Elena Talate, who's on the Caddo governmental board. And she worked with, I think there were 3 fluent Caddo speakers yet living. This was Mr. Edmund Johnson. And they took basically descriptions and photographs of the site. We told them a little bit about, what we had learned through the research for it. And they said, well, how about you use this name? And so Nakukawiddish is basically, it means the place of the water salt. Na in Caddo is basically, it's a locative prefix. So like Nacogdoches, Texas, and Natchitoches, Louisiana are both Caddo words. Anadarko, Oklahoma, I believe, is also a Caddo name. Cuckoo is Caddo for water and Wittish is salt. So we put them all together, Nukuku Wittish. And an important thing to me to, have words to talk about these sites that really reference the people that they're connected to. And I should mention, one of the really neat things about working in the Caddo world is that we have several Caddo scholars and Caddo artists who work very closely with archaeologists on certain things. And one of them, Jerry Redcorn, is a very celebrated potter, has been encouraging us for years to do things like, start renaming pottery types, using Caddo words. And so she and Sean Lambert at Mississippi State a couple years ago suggested that we start calling the type Spiro engraved as Yui engraved, basically meaning eagle. And so there's a move to basically start using more Caddo names and associated with Caddo history. And I think that's a really good thing. And this is a step we took. It's a minor thing, but I think it's a valuable thing in collaboration with the tribe to acknowledge their connections with the past that way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's truly remarkable, and it's always good to see those advances. Now, you mentioned pottery styles there. Let's go back and talk about the site specific. Now, there's a large mound that was found in the fields there in the 1960s, but what makes it different from your typical earthen mound? It has a very unique characteristic.
It had, unfortunately, so I have to talk about in the past tense. It was about 10 feet tall. And we know this because we have one photograph of it that was taken in 1968 by Frank Schambach, and it's got Ernest Seibert standing on it. And I was able to find Ernest's World War II draft card that had it listed as height. And so I used that to, is measured in just under 2 Ernests tall, essentially. But, unlike a lot of mounds that we have here in the Caddo world that were built up with dirt or built for a certain purpose, this mound apparently was almost entirely composed of broken pottery fragments. This was just, we know they were there for hundreds of years making pots to make salt in. Those pots break real quickly, and this huge, basically midden pile grew up. And after several hundred years of this, they had literally a 10-foot tall mound of just broken pottery on the site. It's an absolutely stunning collection. And there's been a handful of projects on other Caddo pottery or Caddo salt sites, and they talk about just how much pottery is present. But I think Nukuku Wittish has probably one of the largest deposits we've ever seen.
Remember seeing that picture during your YouTube presentation, and again, we'll direct people to that presentation in our show notes. But yeah, something that is very pertinent to the story and then what we're talking about here tonight. So please take a look at that photograph. It's truly remarkable. Now, you said we spoke of it in the past tense. So what exactly happened to that mound?
Yeah, well, I'm sure a lot of folks who know about various mounds across the Southeast know that one of the things we often encounter is landowners that have mounds on them sometimes like to have really flat fields, and they don't like having mounds there. And so sometime in the 1970s, the mound was bulldozed to make the field flat. And so much of the site now has about a 20 to 30 centimeter thick stratum of just pottery spread all over the top of it. It's really stunning to go through. When in the 1980s, when Frank had his first training programs out there, they started immediately calling the project More Sherds Than Dirt, because it was just so much stuff, because it was all that mound fill that got bulldozed. Now, apparently part of it did wind up getting sold for fill. There's some Little League fields in DeQueen that reputedly had some of the mound used to build up the land for it. And even hear stories of kids who maybe should have been watching for fly balls, picking for artifacts in the dirt in the outfield. I've heard that from multiple people, so there may be some truth to it.
Yeah,
good story otherwise.
No, that sounds completely logical. I've heard, unfortunately, many times of that sort of thing happening. Now, there you mentioned the 1980 excavation. So let's talk about the the 80s excavations contrasted with the 2022 ones. What were the major obstacles? Obviously, the pottery itself is an obstacle because you have to work through all of that layer. Would you say 20 to 30 centimeters?
Yeah. When Frank was out there in the 1980s, there had not been a major project on a Caddo saltworks ever done up to that point. So sort of working without a roadmap. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Dr. Ann Early, our former state archaeologist, did a project at a separate site called the Hardman site that was getting some adjacent highway was getting some work done. So they sort of stripped the surface of it. So very, very similar to, like some of the work that's been done around Cahokia. And, we can use that a little more as a template now because Ann got all the features and had a lot of the other data worked up. Also, Frank, right as the 86 program was wrapping up, was suffering from a really life-threatening health issue that had been not adequately diagnosed up to that point. And so he was never able to follow through on the project. And, luckily he survived it. He managed to stick around. He left us a couple of years ago, but we were able to enjoy his presence for a long time after that. And when we got interested in going back to this site in the late 2010s, we did have some big hurdles in that, there was just a huge amount of material that hadn't been processed up to that point. A lot of it is still, it had been washed in the 80s, but that was about it. And also, when a project sits around for 40 years without being completed, some records get, a little squirrely, and people who might know where those things are go on to different jobs, become unfindable. Some, pass away, unfortunately. So we had to do a lot of essentially sort of ethnographic work amongst people who, had been there in the past as well. But we also had the ability to go back out there with some tools that we didn't have in the 80s. So geophysics were a big one. And when we started back in on this project, one of the great things about working with the Arkansas Archaeological Society is you have a real great group of volunteers. And they helped us a lot, not only with new excavations, but then we actually took a bunch of the unfinished 1980s artifacts out to the field site, and they processed through basically everything. And it would have been a years-long process if we just tried to do it with our staff and in the research station, and they helped get that all processed. So we've overcome that one hurdle, but just getting our arms around the field component was a challenge, and we've been working our way through it, and it's going well. Literally took years to get here.
Yeah, I'd imagine so. And again, the visual behind this is quite stunning. So when you talk about the washing of pottery and different artifacts from the 1980s, how much are we talking about?
So we store most of our stuff currently in, I think they're 2.5 gallon Rubbermaid tubs. And we had, I want to say, about 450 of those to go through. When they're initially stored in cardboard, the big cardboard flat boxes that I think are fairly commonly known. And that was, remember, before we reboxed a bunch of stuff, there were a couple of sets where it was for one 10 centimeter level out of a 2x2 unit, we had 4 boxes of full, like groaningly full, with sherds from that one level. Now, some of the initial washing back in the 80s was actually done. We just ran out long lines of black plastic, and they're actually pumping water out of the salt marsh to do the initial washing before they get it back to take it to the lab. Crumbly feel to it from having the brine dry on those.
Well, as I'm envisioning this this sort of production going on there on the site, the pottery itself, is it just blank, or do they have incised, punctate, things that you would normally expect to see as far as decoration, or is it just all blank pottery?
It's mostly plain shell-tempered pottery, and I think it's like 99.7% shell-tempered pottery that we found across the site. I mean, we get some punctations, which are honestly one of my favorite things in all archaeology, because most of the punctations that we get on this pottery are fingernail punctations. And so just having like the imprint of, someone's literal body from several hundred years ago. I think it's just so cool. We get rim sherds that have a sort of a punctation that gets smeared over a little bit, probably to provide a little grip around the neck. If you open a book on Caddo pottery types, this is the type we call Nash neck banded, and that's mostly that's about as decorative as we get. Now there are some more elaborately done pieces, because the site was a residence as well as a work area. There were at least 4 people buried there, and so there's some domestic stuff as well. So that you have some more carefully produced types. We have some sherds of a type called Avery engraved that you can also look up. And so those can be more your household wear and less of an industrial thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. So as we get into more about the specifics of the excavation and the discoveries there, you mentioned geophysical work. Talk about the magnetic anomaly that was discovered and what that turned out to be. I thought this was extremely interesting.
Yeah, so back in the 1980s, Frank notes that there were some bricks and some 19th century pottery found, but not a ton. And it's not totally surprising. There are a lot of these salt works do have 19th century components to them, because people are using them in a very similar fashion. But there was never any documentation of a substantial 19th century component to the site when Frank was out there. And before we went out to the site in 2022, we did a geophysical survey. We've done that before each of our summer digs, in part to guide the excavations, but also since we work with the Caddos on developing the research designs, we do that specifically to look for anything that could be a burial, so that we could avoid it. They're very keen to make sure that we take that consideration. So we're happy to do that. Before the 2022 one, there was this massive magnetic anomaly right where Frank Schambach had his headquarters tent set up in the 1980s. And I worked on a couple sites where we've had previous projects, and doing metal detecting and some other things, we find pin flags, foil sandwich wrappers, batteries, pocket change, you name it. There's just people leave behind trash. It just happens. Even if you try to police it up well, some of the stuff gets left behind. So I thought basically this was the detritus of Frank's headquarters tent from the 80s. And as we got digging, one of our first units out there in 2022, as they were cleaning off the profile wall, started finding brick. And I'm like, okay, that's not terribly surprised by that. And then we cleaned off a little more, and it was in situ coursed brick, which that was a little different. Don't see a ton of that out in the rural part of the world. And we also noticed that it was very soft, handmade brick, which for rural Arkansas, that's usually an indicator that it's pre-railroad. Once you get the railroad in, people start getting machine-made bricks, and they're very different. So pretty sure that this was, okay, we've got a foundation of a house here, because it looked like a big curtain wall. Thought that would be a little weird, because this rural Arkansas antebellum period, typically if you're going to have a house out in the countryside, it's either going to be big enough that it's well remembered in local histories, or it's going to be put on like stone piers. Brick curtain wall foundations are simply not a thing. Said, okay, well, it's in this excavation wall. We'll open the next unit to the north and see how wide the wall is, and see if we can get a footprint. Well, we opened that excavation unit, the brick just kept going, and it went the entire way across the unit. And turns out it wasn't a foundation wall at all. It was actually a salt furnace that dates back to the 1830s, if not the 1820s. It's one of the few ever encountered in like a rural context. There's been some work on sort of the archaeology of salt, but mostly that's in places like Saltville, Virginia, or Liverpool, New York, where they have these sort of big industrial operations. This one is, it's a very small operation, but it's set up to basically to supply, just a very local populace. A total surprise. I don't know how Frank got his tent stakes in around around this thing because it's a solid massive brick. It's incredible.
Yeah, that was one of the most interesting parts. Was out of everywhere he could have set up, he happened to be really directly on top of this salt furnace.
Yeah. Well, and I talked with other, Frank had passed, but I talked to some of the other station archaeologists who had been at the project in the 80s. Yeah, none of them had, any idea that it was there. I mentioned like, hey, we found this thing. They're totally gobsmacked by it.
Yeah, again, it's just one of those things, the joys of archaeology, if you will. So in addition to the salt furnace, let's kind of complete Area A. So ultimately, what were the most significant findings that were coming out of Area A?
So Area A is basically more heavily focused on the Caddo component to the site. And we've got in there both a salt production area where you have essentially some sort of reddened earth with a lot of charcoal flecks in it, and then these little shell concentration, but mostly sherd clusters and sherd concentrations, sometimes sherd stacks. And essentially what that is when the Caddos were making salt, they were making these sort of large open, sort of looks like a campfire, but many feet across. And so the reddening of the earth relates to that, the charcoal flecking comes from that, and then those stacks of sherds are basically elevators that they're putting pots on so that you can put them up a little ways, get a little more fuel underneath, and heat the brine inside a little better. Now, the pots that they're making are basically, sort of like a terracotta consistency, so they're not watertight. And one of the things that makes these things really short use life is the brine will seep into the pot as it's boiling, and then when the salt comes out of solution, those crystals expand. And so it basically levers the pot apart very quickly, which gives us a 10-foot tall mound of pottery. And then this past summer, we found a feature where somehow the pottery got even denser than the surrounding area, which is impressive, but also had whole pieces of mussel shell in it. Now, we know that that's brought in because the salt pond doesn't support freshwater mussels. You have to bring those in. You can get them on the Rolling Fork River, which is a mile or so away, but those have to be brought in to put in the pottery. And what we think we had there basically was sort of the edge of the salt production area, where you have these sherds that are being used as elevators and some broken pots, and that area gets cleaned periodically, and you wind up with this sort of small midden of pot sherds situated right on sort of the edge of the reduction area. As you get outside of that, and all of a sudden we've got a whole bunch of post holes showing up. Mentioned before, there were a few burials encountered out there, and dog burials and other things. So it looks like we have the residential area adjacent to the work area.
Yeah. So based off of that residential area and the archaeology of that portion, is there an estimate of the population? How many people might have been working there at any one given time?
My guess is it would be maybe 1 to 2 families at a time. It's probably really small. We know it was inhabited on a long-term basis. One of the things we're going to be doing with it next is really trying to identify houses in the feature maps. But I mentioned Ann Early's excavation at Hardman. Hardman's really interesting that you had, since they were able to get the entire feature map for the site, you have a couple of houses and granaries inside a literal sort of open stockade, which we haven't seen that at Nakukawitish, but these are very clearly, they're investing the time to build a house and live there on a long-term basis. We know from some historical accounts in the 1600s, Caddos at that point are, making salt at these salt sites on a temporary basis. They'll come for a couple of weeks, make the salt, and then leave. With Hardman and Nakukawitish, you're clearly living there on a full-time basis. And it's probably a small family group that is essentially living there full-time.
Yeah, so when I was looking at the site initially, I was envisioning, a large group because of the large mound of people kind of bustling about and working kind of around the clock. But let's talk about salt itself. So obviously there's some clear indications of uses for salt, but was it sort of an economic focus for the Caddo, or were they just distributing it to local families? What do we know about the extent of the movement of the salt?
We know that they are trading it. You get a little west of the site, you get it on the plains, and there aren't salt deposits out there. So this is something that gets traded. There are some accounts from the 16 and 1700s of the Caddos actively trading with groups both to the west and to the east. And the scale of production that you get at the Kukawitish, to me, suggests they're doing something more than just local consumption with, because they're making so much of it. Because you get that built up mound. I think that's more than what in other areas where there's also salt making going on. We don't see that same level of detritus. It suggests it's a smaller scale. Now, it's important to note that with the Kukawitish, it's one of the earlier Caddo salt sites. So some of the sites have been investigated in like North Louisiana, North Texas, date to at the earliest sort of the mid 1400s into the 1600s. The Kukawitish, some of our earliest carbon dates from the site date to the mid 1200s. And so it's early, and I think there's maybe a more heavy production focus early on, and that when you get into the 1500s, 1600s, the how people are using it and how they're producing it changes a little bit, and there's not the economics aren't set up in a similar fashion.
Yeah, so again, the systems and the trade and all of these things are always fascinating to me. It's one of the most interesting parts of the river systems and the creek systems and everything in that region. As we begin to wrap up our discussion here tonight, let's talk a little bit about the other half of an archaeological site work. We have the excavations, and of course we have the lab work. So, from your own excavations and of course the previous ones from the 80s, tell us a little bit about that team that's doing the lab work. Has there been any significant discoveries found during the lab portion?
Yeah, so the team is survey staff, a lot of society volunteers, and some students here at Southern Arkansas University, a couple of local volunteers as well. Still have a lot of bags of sherds to go through from the past couple of years. That's going to take a year or two to finish up. But when we start going through those bags of artifacts, we get some projectile points. We get a couple of clay pipe fragments. Had a bone bead, first one that's seen come off the site. And and working in Arkansas, one of our great resources is the Arkansas Archaeological Society has what they call the Archaeological Research Fund, where they support small grants to do various things, and they've paid for a lot of radiocarbon dates from the site. And so we're starting to get a feel not just for the sort of overall range of dates from the site, but also different dates within the site itself. And I should also know we've got a volunteer, Beverly Watkins, who has been doing a lot of work on the early 19th century historical records for Southwest Arkansas in general, but she's paid very close attention to some of the salt resources here, and has been able to tease out some of the people who might be connected to it and some of the chronology of the site. And we've actually figured out that this site was one of three, at least, salt sites that caused Arkansas's western border to be deliberately missurveyed in the 1830s. There was a 3D struck with the Choctaws that was supposed to define the border between Arkansas and the Choctaw Nation. I was running from a spot, I think it was like 100 paces west of Fort Smith, due south to the Red River. And James Sevier Conway, the surveyor and later governor, nudged that line over about 1.36 degrees and as a result, the Kukowitish and 2 other salt sites wound up on the American side of that line and not the Choctaw side. And apparently, according to the 1830s, this was somewhat deliberately done to make sure that all those salt sites wound up in American hands.
Yeah, that sounds completely rational.
Yeah. I should note in the 1880s, the state of Arkansas did pay a settlement to the Choctaw Nation over it, but it's still sort of an unneighborly thing to do.
For sure.
In the first place.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I know you said that you have a lot to process from the previous excavations, getting all the records and everything together, but are there future plans for the site right now that you know of?
Yeah, well, actually, we're going out. We've got one more year with the training program out there. And we'll start June 1st, and we'll be filling in between some of the excavation units that have been out there in the past. And that will hopefully allow us to write up, 40 years of research, and also provide some programming to the Caddo Nation about, this part of their, what archaeologists have figured out about what this part of their past. And also we have a guidance document here in Arkansas called the State Plan. It's got regional summaries for what we know archaeologically about every part of the state, with the exception of one. And the one that we don't have that for is the Little River drainage, which includes this site. So we'll be able to write that more effectively and use that a bunch of public outreach and education venues as well.
Well, that's great. It sounds like this site has a lot more to offer in the coming years. We've been speaking tonight with Dr. Carl Drexler, station archaeologist and research associate professor at the University of Arkansas. Dr. Drexler, if anybody wants to follow along with your work and learn a little bit more about what you're doing on the site, how can they follow you? And take a moment to tell us about the Trowel and Transit blog.
For my job, you can follow the Arkansas Archaeological Survey, both our Facebook and Instagram. We also have the SAU research station of the survey has its own Facebook and Instagram resources. During the training program, we'll be posting a lot of photos and other stuff on those. And then the Travel and Transit blog is basically my personal musings about various things archaeological. It's not just Caddo stuff. It's there's some conflict archaeology as well.
Well, that's great. Again, congratulations on the work that you're doing there. It's, again, very interesting, fascinating discussion here tonight with Dr. Carl Drexler. Again, thank you for your time tonight, and we'll look forward to talking to you in the future.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, another great interview there with Dr. Carl Drexler of Southern Arkansas University. I learned a lot during this one. Again, the Caddo word is something that I've seen used in a lot of different types and different ways over the years, but it was good to actually fill in some of those details and get a better understanding of a group of people that's very close to James there in his home state of Arkansas. So again, we thank Dr. Drexler for joining us, and hopefully everyone learned something from this episode as I did.
Well, we always learn things here in the Crosstime Pub, and of course it's a fun way to do it. It's a fun environment to learn, and I just hope that maybe with the coming of spring, I'm ready for the winter weather. I've woken up twice this year already to snow. And I ain't complaining. It's beautiful here in Appalachia when there's a dusting of snow on the ground. Nothing better than pulling back the curtains in the morning and looking outside and seeing the sunshine peeking over the treetops and through the snow that's blowing around in the Appalachian air. But that all said, once it gets warm, I may have to get out there and hit the trail because I am itching to see what is happening out there in the world of archaeology. For the time being, as these winter months ensue, we're going to have to do that from here in the Crosstime Pub. But guys, as is tradition, I'd like you now to join me over there where they are pouring the final pints of the eve. What say ye, gents?
I say, as long as there's no snow involved, I'm your man.
You don't like that snow very much, do you? Well, then a frosty pint is what you'll receive, James Waldo. That'll keep you cool in the meantime. Please, everybody, follow us over there at 7ages.org and, of course, on all the social media channels where we operate online. Join the subscribers. Interact with us on Facebook in our official Facebook group. And as always, on behalf of James Waldo, Jason Pentrail, and yours truly, Micah Hanks, we are the 7 Ages Research Associates, and we'll see you somewhere in time right here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.